I'm so sorry, man, but I had to do it to you. It's the camera. It's cursed. It wouldn't let me put it down. It made me send it off. I'm sorry, but now you gotta listen to the stories. It's Wendall Lane. So, good luck.
I am not a paranormal investigator. I am an author. While looking for inspiration for a book, I came across a series of stories surrounding a home in the American Pacific Northwest. It is an extremely ordinary-looking house in an extremely ordinary-looking residential neighborhood. But the stories that have emanated from its former residents and the people who lived in the town that it's located in are quite extraordinary. Through my research of the house on Wendall Lane, I have come across accounts that range from the supernatural to just plain bizarre. In order to protect the privacy of the people in the town and the current inhabitants of the house on Wendall Lane, I have not only changed the name of everyone in these stories, but the name of the street as well. Wendall Lane is just an alias for the true location of these accounts. This is the Wendall Lane Diaries. Dr. Sandy Reeve, now deceased, was a clinical psychologist with over 30 years of experience working with patients suffering from extreme psychological disorders. She was renowned and respected in her field. After retirement, Dr. Reeve published a series of best-selling books detailing some of her most interesting case studies. What you are about to hear is a chapter from her book, The Mad, Mad Mind, My Most Dangerous Patients, that was left on the cutting room floor. I was given the manuscript by a former intern at the publishing company. The story relayed to me was that Sandy was insistent on printing the chapter exactly as you'll hear it tonight, but after a lengthy back and forth was eventually dissuaded by her publisher. It was believed by those in the company that if published, this anecdote, the case of Stephen Haim, may have hurt her credibility in the medical world, which could have in turn affected book sales.
I had been working at Sequoia State Mental Health Center, a psychiatric hospital located in Northern California, for 3 years when Stephen Haim was admitted under my care. He was a shy man with a soft voice and a gentle disposition. An avid reader, Stephen would spend much of his free time, of which there was plenty at Sequoia, losing himself in any book he could get his hands on, especially science fiction novels. Stephen was a ward of the state. When I first met him, he was struggling with mild depression and a crippling drug addiction, but one thing he was most certainly not struggling with was his sanity. Aside from his dependence on illegal narcotics, the young man was as lucid and rational as any nurse, guard, or doctor in the facility. So why had he been committed to Sequoia? For a mandatory 6 years, no less, a hospital that housed criminals so mentally unstable that they had been deemed unfit for general lockup at state penitentiaries? Well, one might assume it was to get his drug habit under control, but the answer is far more complicated than that. In the fall of 1989, Stephen murdered his older sister, Janice Haim, while under the influence of a dissociative hallucinogenic drug known as PCP. By the time he came down from his high, a full day had passed and he was locked inside a holding cell at the county jail. His new surroundings had come as a huge shock to his now sober mind, but even more troubling for Stephen were the circumstances involving his incarceration. He maintained to have had no recollection of the entire event and was horrified when he heard that he had murdered Janice's only remaining family member in cold blood. Stephen's claim of memory loss was not a new precedent. There have been many well-documented instances of people suffering blackouts while abusing powerful hallucinogenic drugs. After a series of long, rigorous police interrogations, hypnotherapy sessions, and multiple injections of sodium amytal, it was determined that Stephen was, in fact, telling the truth. He was not lying about memory lapse, nor was his memory somehow being repressed by a guilty subconscious. No, Stephen was dealing with full-blown amnesia and had completely forgotten everything that had happened. It was determined that he had lost complete control of his faculties while under the influence of the drug and was therefore not fully responsible for Janice's death. Similarly, people suffering from temporal lobe seizures have at times been known to perform extreme acts of violence without even realizing it. In these instances, they are not considered culpable, but are still handled by the state and sometimes committed to mental health facilities for the benefit of their own well-being. To make matters trickier, Janice was killed in such a gruesome manner that the psychologist overseeing the case advised the court not to inform Stephen of the horrific details unless he insisted on disputing the accusations leveled against him. He did not, which was probably for the best since the evidence was overwhelming anyway. His hearing was held in camera. This was done for two reasons. Firstly, to protect Stephen, already grieving the loss of a loved one, from learning the macabre truth about his sister's final moments, and secondly, to prevent the press from catching wind of the event and sparking up a media circus around a man who's already suffering a great deal. The entire matter was taken care of swiftly, and Stephen was sent to Sequoia, where I would work with him for the next 6 years. In that time, I would get to know him quite well. As the primary psychologist treating him at the hospital, I was privy to all the details of Janice Haim's murder, but I made sure never to bring them up with Stephen, who had elected to remain ignorant to the grisly specifics involving his sister's death. My main focus was to help him battle his addiction and aid him in overcoming the guilt he felt for killing her. My strategy was a success. Within a few months, Stephen had put the drugs behind him, and by the spring of 1990, he had seemed to make peace with his dubious past. Still, I couldn't help but feel sorry for Stephen, one of the few patients at the center not dealing with a debilitating mental illness, yet forced to mingle and interact with schizophrenics, manic depressives, and people suffering from dissociative identity disorder. In my opinion, he was ready to leave the facility after a year because his stay at the hospital was court-mandated. He was forced to wait out the entirety of his sentence. To his credit, he had accepted the hand he was dealt, often telling me during our one-on-one sessions that he was just thankful the judge's ruling hadn't been more severe. Nevertheless, once his mandatory time at the clinic was up, I was happy to proclaim to the board overseeing his release that Stephen was of sound mind and ready to reintegrate into society. He was released on November 14, 1995, still a relatively young man with his whole life ahead of him. I remember feeling a strong sense of accomplishment as he walked out the door, one stronger than I'd felt with any of the other patients I'd treated at that hospital. Often, my job was to teach people under my care how to manage their illnesses without becoming a danger to themselves and others. Stephen, on the other hand, was cured. His drug habit long gone, and his self-loathing no longer an issue. I felt confident that he would turn his life around and not slip back into that drug habit that had flipped his entire world upside down. 2 years later, after his probation lifted, I heard he moved up north and rented a house in a sleepy little town out of state. In the summer of '99, I received a letter that Stephen had sent to my office requesting a telephone consultation. He needed advice about some recent problems he'd been experiencing and had written a phone number at the bottom of the page where I could reach him. If it were anyone else, I probably would have simply written them back with a recommendation for a clinician in their area that could help them. It goes against my code of ethics, you see, to give professional advice to patients no longer under my care, but I felt a sort of irrational sense of guilt after watching Stephen spend so many unnecessary years locked away at Sequoia, so against my better judgment, I picked up the phone and dialed his number. I was a bit disturbed when I heard how nervous and panicky Stephen sounded when he picked up the line. Right away I began to wonder if he was using again. I asked him if that was the case, and he assured me he was not. He had even deliberately chosen an employer that drug tested so he wouldn't be tempted to revert back to his old ways. It was a relief to hear, but his reason for writing me was disconcerting nonetheless. Stephen Haim, a man I had never truly felt belonged in a mental institution, was beginning to grow concerned with the status of his own mental health. He explained that the trouble was stemming from a strong putrid odour that he could detect whenever he was inside the house he was renting. Stephen said the smell was akin to raw sewage. At first he thought there was a problem with his plumbing, but when his landlord sent a maintenance crew to his home to investigate, nobody but Stephen seemed to be able to detect the stink. He invited neighbours over to get a second opinion, but still the phantom stench appeared to be perceivable only to him. It had gotten far worse in recent days. The odour was now more powerful than ever, and yet no one else, no matter who he asked, seemed to smell it at all. He had decided that the whole thing was in his head, so he contacted me for an opinion. I told him that the odour could very well be in his head, but I didn't think it meant that he was losing his mind. To me, the most plausible likelihood was that Stephen was experiencing some sort of olfactory hallucinations induced by flashbacks from his days with PCP. These hallucinations, referred to in the medical field as phantosmia, are sometimes known to spring up in people with a history of abusing hallucinogenic drugs, even if they've been sober for years. I then explained to him that the smell was probably harmless and would go away with time, but that phantosmia can occur in people suffering from seizures, so I gave him the number of a nearby neurologist and asked him to set up an appointment to get checked out. He thanked me for easing his concerns and told me he would call the doctor later that week. Stephen Haim would then drift from my mind until a second letter arrived at my house a few days later. The return address was identical to Stephen's, but to my surprise it had been written by a woman named Colette, who claimed to be his fiancée. I was startled to learn that her reason for writing was to inform me that Stephen had recently committed suicide. His funeral would be held over the next weekend, and she very much hoped that I would be able to make it. I was extremely saddened to hear about Stephen's tragic death. A strange feeling of guilt swept over me. I'd spoken to him so recently. If only I'd been able to recognize the signs. Perhaps it was the same guilt that spurred me to cancel my plans and make my way up north for the weekend to pay my respects. I arrived in town on the morning of the funeral. The ceremony was scheduled for the early afternoon, but Colette's letter had requested I stop by to speak to her beforehand. I wasn't sure what it was she wanted to discuss, but I rented a car at the airport and headed straight over to the house to meet her. I was greeted at the front door by a young woman with a sharp jaw and striking blue eyes. She introduced herself as Colette and invited me inside. We sat down at the kitchen table and made some small talk for a bit, mostly about the time I spent working with Stephen at Sequoia. Before she confessed the reason why she had asked me to come over, she told me that the last few days had raised a lot of questions about Stephen's past, questions that she knew I had the answers to, and she was hoping to talk about them with me. Stephen's hallucinations had gotten worse after our conversation on the phone. It wasn't long before the horrible phantom odour he had complained to me about was accompanied by an equally foul taste that he couldn't get out of his mouth. Colette explained that he would go through half a bottle of mouthwash every day, but no matter how often he rinsed and gargled and spit, the taste always remained. It had gotten so bad, in fact, that he had stopped eating. As I listened to her speak, I wondered if this too could have been a hallucination induced by his prior drug use, but when Colette started on the topic of Stephen's nightmares, my mind began to formulate another, much more fascinating theory. And this is where I begin to detail the night that Stephen Haim killed his sister. On October 22nd, 1989, Stephen was alone smoking PCP in the apartment he and Janice shared. For whatever reason, the drug sent him into a frenzy. As luck would have it, Janice arrived home just in time to catch him at the height of his drug-fueled rage. Stephen strangled her on the living room floor. As he choked the life from her, he gnawed on her face, tearing flesh away and mangling her features until her corpse was completely unrecognizable. The brutality did not end there. Stephen would take a pocket knife to Janice, opening up a gash in her body that ran from her lower abdomen all the way to her sternum. He would then proceed to devour much of her organs, including her stomach, liver, and large intestines. Covered in blood and excrement that police found a wild-eyed Stephen still chewing on his sister's entrails. This was the memory that was believed to have been erased from Stephen Haim's mind, yet years later, according to Colette's story, it somehow resurfaced in his nightmares. Every night he dreamed the same detailed, disgusting scene, exactly as it had really happened. I theorized that the phantom smell and taste had been tormenting him, must have been memories of the incident manifesting themselves in his brain by dominating his sensory stimuli. The constant aroma of raw sewage lingering in his mouth and nose was actually Stephen's mind remembering the flavour of his sister's bowels. It seemed as though Stephen realized this as well and couldn't bear the burden of guilt his newly returned memories had placed on his shoulders. The truth about what he did to his sister was too much. He used a razor blade to slice his wrist. His body wouldn't be discovered until hours later when the landlord stopped by the house for scheduled repairs. Colette finished his story abruptly, thanked me for stopping by, then ushered me quickly to the door before I could even weigh in on what she had said. She promised me that we'd talk more at the funeral, but she had to take care of a few more arrangements first before it got underway. I spent the next few hours in a daze. Never before in my professional career had I heard of memories manifesting themselves in such peculiar ways. The entire situation was so bizarre I wanted to hear more about it. I arrived at the funeral later that afternoon. A small group had turned out to mourn the loss of Stephen. Most of the people there had only known him for a short period of time, but it was clear that he had made a favourable impression on all of them, just as he had on me when I first started working with him. Curiously absent from the ceremony was Colette. Given her relationship with Stephen, I would have assumed that she'd been the one who would greet everybody at the door. I found it odd that she wasn't around, but I imagine that perhaps seeing her fiancé inside a casket might have been too trying for her. I expected to catch up with her later, but even at the wake, Colette was nowhere to be seen. It was during the wake that I met Rami, the only other person who had known Stephen before he was committed. They'd been friends since they were kids, but I was surprised when Rami told me that he had been the one who organised the funeral. Again, I expected it would have been Colette, especially since she'd made it seem that way when she hurried out of the house. He asked me how I'd heard about the funeral, and I told him about the letter Stephen's fiancée had sent me after he committed suicide. My comment left him perplexed. He was certain that Stephen had never been engaged. I mentioned Colette by name, and he told me that he'd never heard of her before. Next to us was a memorial wreath that had been decorated with old photographs taken of Stephen throughout the years. One of the pictures caught my eye. The photo couldn't have been taken more than a year before Stephen was committed to Sequoia, because he was the spitting image of when I had first met him. Standing next to him was a woman with a sharp jaw and an unmistakable pair of striking blue eyes. That was Colette. She looked exactly the same in the photo she did when she greeted me at the door. I showed Rami the picture triumphantly, but he fell silent when he saw who I was talking about. I just can't tell if you're joking or not, he finally told me. But I was the one who snapped that picture you're holding. That girl's name isn't Colette, it's Janice, Stephen's sister, and that photo was taken just a few days before she was killed.
Jacksonville, I love you! I know you do. Hey, I love me too!
Can I, touch it? Oh my God.
Son of a bitch. Not again.
Oh, shit!
We're gonna go to Elk Grove, Michigan. That's my hometown. Then put an end to this horse pucky once and for all.
Whatever happened in this town seems to really haunt him.
Ash, I had to summon you. Help me retrieve the book and send them back to hell.
Oh, you need my help. Here's what I need. I need to be back in Jacksonville on my second keg of beer, putting my spicy man meat into a mother-daughter sandwich.
Part of me is already regretting calling you here.
Get used to that feeling. We gave peace a chance. Now it's time for war. others. Ladies first.
That is horrible and also awesome.
Which is everything that I do.